Hi there everyone, my name's David Churchill. I'm a lecturer at the University of Leeds and it's a pleasure to join you today to talk about the history of Leeds parks. What I'm going to say relates to some work that I've done with a number of colleagues at the university over recent years, where we've been looking at both the history of parks in Leeds and also where they are today and the issues facing them into the future. But for today's purposes, I'm just going to focus on the history really, where our parks have come from. I'm sure we're all familiar with Leeds Parks today. The city has some wonderful parks, and we're very, very lucky in that respect. But sometimes people aren't really very sure about where they've come from. Often these days it can seem like a public park is a natural part of the city. It's a kind of, a natural accompaniment to urban life as we know it. Um, but actually they have quite specific origins in the Victorian period. And that's really what I'm going to be focusing on talking about today. And I think it's important, I think if we know a little bit more about where they've come from, we might see them a little bit differently, and we might think a little bit differently about how we relate to them today. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about over the coming 15 minutes or so. Now, I think we can say that the idea of the public park, as we know it, was born in the early part of the 19th century. That's the early 1800s. This was a time when cities across the country were growing at a very considerable rate. It was also a time of major industrial change, the rise of factory industry, big, heavy polluting industry, and so on. And so cities like Leeds were being transformed. There was more and more people living there. There was associated with that overcrowding, and there was also industrial change, pollution concerns, all these kinds of things. So that's really the context from which the idea of the public park begins to take hold. So in the early part of the 1800s, people started to become keen on the idea that to try to help alleviate some of these difficulties, they'd set aside particular parts of the city as green spaces, which were open for everybody to use. And that openness, that accessibility, is reflected in the name that they gave them at that time, which is not so often, they didn't call them a public park, but they tended to call them people's parks, stressing the fact that these were parks for the whole of the people of the city, the whole of the urban community, if you like, and not just for a particular section of society. So it's at that time that the People's Park idea arises. Now, what did people hope their parks would deliver? How did they hope they would change the city? I think there's three things we can say about that. The first, pretty straightforwardly, they hope they will provide a space for recreation, a space for people to enjoy themselves, to relax, to play. There was obviously at this time, as there's lots of building work and so on, there's a lack of spaces where people could enjoy themselves. The most obvious space for children to play and so on was in the streets outside their houses, which created all kinds of problems. So the idea of setting aside green spaces was to give ordinary people in particular somewhere where they could relax and enjoy themselves. But I think there are two other things that people hoped they would get out of parks, having parks in their cities. The first is an improvement in public health. So as I said, this was a time of great pollution. It was a time of much disease as well. It was a time which people were really concerned about the health of people living in cities and the effect of urban life, of living in cities, on their health. So that's one of the things they hoped that the park would help deal with. Now, the exact way they thought it would do that is at this time people tended to think that disease travelled in the air. This is before a developed theory of germs or anything like that. So they thought that that there would be kind of pockets of bad air that would get trapped in a city, and that's where disease would come from. So what was needed was something to help circulate the air through the city, to help bring fresh air in and let all the bad air out. And that's really what parks were there for, in that sense, because if you left an area of the city undeveloped without any buildings on it and just made it into a green space, the hope was that would allow fresh air to come in, bad air to go out of the city. And for that reason, parks were sometimes at this time talked about as the lungs of the city, the lungs of Leeds, and so on. So that's the first additional thing that people hoped they would get out of their parks. And the second thing is they hoped it would provide a space for people in the city to mix together, to come together from different walks of life. It was a time when people were concerned that richer people in the city were starting to live in some areas and poorer people in other areas, and that they didn't know anything about each other's ways of life and so on. And so it's hoped that parks would provide a space where people would come together in an orderly way, and in a relaxed atmosphere, in order to get to know each other a little bit better. So to provide a space of social mixing, in other words, between people from different walks of life. So that idea takes hold, and in the 1820s, 1830s, you start to see the first cities developing these sorts of parks, people's parks, which were often developed by city councils, so local government institutions. And so that's really the time this starts to take hold. Now, Leeds comes along a little bit late to the party, but it does eventually get there in the 1850s. And in 1857, the town council acquired the first municipal park, the first publicly funded park in Leeds, which was Woodhouse Moor. So as I say, that was established in 1857. Now, what I want to talk about for the rest of this presentation is about what making a park entailed. So I've just said that they get their first park in 1857. What does that mean practically? What did Victorian governors, councillors, and so on have to do in order to make the kind of parks that we know today? Well, there's basically three things. The first of those, most obviously, they have to get a certain area of land, okay, for a park to exist in. So this means they have to identify an area of land which might make a suitable park, and they need to raise the funds to purchase it. Now, both of those things could be tricky for different reasons. So if we take that first park, Woodhouse Moor, that was acquired in the 1850s, there were issues around both of those things. So they identified the space pretty easily because Woodhouse Moor was already an open green space that people use for recreation, they use for large public meetings, all other kinds of things. So it's a pretty obvious space to be purchased and kept free of development as a public park. The problem was that because it was an historic space which people had many uses for, the council found that local people in particular, had other claims on that land that conflicted in some ways with it becoming a public park. So some local people, for example, claimed they had a right to graze cows on the land or to keep sheep on the land. A few people had built little buildings on the land. There was a little pub in the middle of it. So people had already different ways of using the land, that moorland, that historic piece of land, that were not compatible with it being an open public park for people to use for recreation and so on. And so there was a protracted process which took years where the council had to negotiate with these people how to settle their existing claims on that moor space with the new council ownership and the new use of the land as a public park. And that took a number of years, and it delayed some of the early development of the park for that reason. So that's as far as getting the piece of land. But the second thing is funding the purchase. So Woodhouse Moor was not a vastly expensive project. At the time, it was not the most expensive thing the council was doing. However, it was a considerable sum of money, and that money had to come from local people out of their local taxes or rates. Now, the problem was, who was going to pay for it? Was it just going to be the people who lived in the centre of Leeds, which is roughly the area where Woodhouse Moor was, just to the north of the city centre? Or was it to come from the whole of the city and all of the people who lived in the city, which was a very wide area extending well beyond the built-up area in the middle of the city to out townships 3, 4, 5 miles away? Now, those people would think, this park is miles away from where we live. These are often not the most wealthy people in the city, and so they understandably objected to having to pay extra taxes to pay for a park that was to be there in the city centre. And so that was another source of concern, and a long debate went on about that before eventually they had a compromise and settled on how to pay for the park. So that example illustrates how both of those processes could be difficult, could pose problems in terms of getting parks underway. However, once we've got a piece of land and we've found a way of paying for it, the next thing we have to do, the second stage in making a park, is designing it. This means basically making it into a space that we would recognize to be a park. Now, at the time, of course, people were making up what that kind of space would look like. So they were kind of, they were inventing the rules of what a park looked like for the first time. But all the common things that we know associated with parks, they developed at that time. So making sure it was a green space, so improving the grass if there was grass there already, making sure that it was a reasonably accessible terrain, so draining the land. If it was really muddy and boggy, you might have to put an effort to drain the land to make it the kind of space that people could use in all weathers. Planting, putting flower beds in, planting gardens, planting trees, laying out paths so that people could, again, navigate the land in all different kinds of conditions. So all of these things had to be done because these spaces, when they were brought up, were generally open spaces, but they were not the kind of spaces that people really wanted to spend a lot of time in. They were not particularly beautiful spaces. Now, it was important for the people who created parks that they should be beautiful spaces because it was hoped that that beautiful environment would rub off on the people using it, that it would sort of give them an uplift, that it would improve them somehow as people, both make them feel better, but also make them into better people. So that was why they were particularly concerned about making these attractive, nice spaces, not just so they're enjoyable, but also so that they'd rub off well on the people of the city. So as I say, this included all these kinds of ways of making the sites more attractive. And then as we get into the later 19th century, so the late 1800s, there's an increasing emphasis in terms of improving people's health on physical exercise and recreation, much as we know it today. And so what this meant was that parks additionally around this time started to include many more sporting games facilities. So bowling greens, tennis courts, football pitches, even outdoor swimming pools in the case of Roundhay Park eventually. So it's from that time that you start to see the development of sporting activity spaces, specific spaces for that within parks. And so gradually then over the course of the 19th century, they got used to the idea of what a public park should look like, and making these sites look something like that was that crucial second stage in making public parks. So you've got your piece of land, you've bought it, you've made it look a bit like a park. The last major thing that people had to do in order to make these spaces properly recognized as parks was to regulate them, and particularly to regulate the behavior of people using those spaces. Obviously, on sunny days, on popular holidays, these parks could be pretty crowded spaces, even the really big ones. And as I said before, people from different walks of life were encountering each other on a fairly rare occasion. And they had different expectations about how to use the space. So some people might want fun and games, and some people might want peace and quiet. And this meant that there was a bit of conflict sometimes around different people trying to enjoy parks in different ways. And so one of the things that people recognized was crucial to developing lasting public parks was to regulate the behavior of people, to try to reduce that conflict, to try to reduce the scope for upset, and so on, make sure everybody could enjoy the space together. And what this means practically is that over the course of the century, the town council produce a long list of bylaws. These are local regulations which prescribe what people could and couldn't do in park spaces. As I say, at the beginning, there's no regulations for this. These are new spaces. People are making the rules up for the first time. But they start off regulating all kinds of things, from really simple things like not picking the flowers or not digging up the plants, which did happen, all the way through to things like what kinds of games are allowed or particularly not allowed. Cricket was a popular one. Everything else pretty much was banned until later in the 19th century, when I say they start to create beautiful spaces for sport. As new kinds of enjoyments come in, those need to be regulated. So bicycles are invented in the late 19th century. This creates problems with people careering across parks and so on and taking out other visitors. So those have to be regulated. And all the way through to certain sorts of people who are not welcome in parks or who are not appreciated in parks and might have to be removed. And these included, for example, homeless people, gypsies, and so on. While the park was in theory open to everyone, in practice, some sorts of people were banned or turned away or turfed out of parks as well, because they were seen to be somehow um, not able to be improved in the way that most people were. So a very wide range, quite a mixture of regulations that went into making parks spaces which people thought would have a kind of orderly kind of enjoyment or permit a kind of orderly enjoyment. One interesting thing to think about here is who was actually enforcing these regulations. So some park users did it themselves, particularly with children. If they were acting out of line, then other people would discipline them directly. But most of the enforcement work was on the park staff, so the gardeners and the park keepers. They were the front line of people having to put these regulations into practice. But where necessary, they also fell back on support for the city's police force. And interestingly, when the first major round of police stations is built in the late 1850s, this is exactly the time that Woodhouse Moor, that park that I talked about earlier on, was being established, and a police station gets put just on the edge of Woodhouse Moor. The idea being that this was a space that, while it was potentially very useful and potentially very improving for the city, also was potentially a space in which there might be conflict and problems. And so it was interesting they decided to site one of those police stations on their first park when it was first established. So that, I think, gives you an idea, hopefully, of how these parks came to be, what kind of work went into making them, and what some of the vision behind making them was in the 19th century. What can we learn from this for today? I think there's basically two things that are quite interesting to observe. The first of these is that an awful lot of work went into making these parks. They're so familiar to us as spaces that it's easy to miss that or to forget that, to think that they were somehow sort of always there, or it was just a case of putting a few bushes in place or something. All of these things that we take for granted about the kinds of spaces that parks are had to be thought up for the first time. And so while in some sense the parks we have today reflect those ideas of people who lived long ago, and they might not always be appropriate to what we want parks to be, the very spaces themselves and the idea that there are such spaces that are not built on the city, that's a precious inheritance that we've got. And so it's really something that we owe to people who are living 150 odd years ago. And the second thing I think we can notice here is that this process of making parks takes a lot of time, and in some sense it's never really finished. So obviously a piece of land is purchased and so on, that's done. But designing a park, making it into a park, a space that we would recognize to be a park, and regulating the conduct of people who use it, figuring out what's okay in parks and what's not, that's work that never finishes. That's work that's always ongoing. And so I think the other thing to realize is that parks continue to exist because people continue to put that kind of work in that we associate with their founders. The work of maintaining parks, as we would now say, which is really continually remaking them as we see fit. And so I think if we're interested in preserving our parks going forward into the future, or interested in supporting them, then we might ask what part we can play in that process, what part we can play in trying to make parks, continue to make parks for future generations. So that's about what I have to say. Hopefully that was some interest. Hopefully you've learnt something. If you'd like to know more about the research that we've done, you can find out more on our project website. That's www.futureofparks.leeds.ac.uk. So you can look up more about what we found out there. We've also, in the course of our research, collected a load of photographs of parks through time, including a load of new historic photographs of parks in the 19th and early 20th century. So if you're interested in looking a little bit more at what these parks looked like at that time, you can do so through Leodis, the city's photographic archive collection, again online. So if you search for Leodis, and if you search for the Leodis Parks collection, then you can find a selection of the images there, and find out a way to look at the whole batch of images as well if you're interested. So hopefully that was some interest. Thanks very much for listening, and hope you guys enjoyed the rest of the day. Thank you.